You walked into a routine checkpoint thinking nothing would happen. Same road, same rush hour, same tired sighs from commuters eager to get home. But when officers zeroed in on your address, something invisible shifted in the air. Cuffs closed, around your wrists like a verdict already decided by forces you couldn't see. They joked with each other, they searched with practiced hands, they whispered about places like yours with a familiarity that spoke of countless repetitions. In less than 10 minutes, a routine traffic stop would expose a system built not to protect and serve, but to break certain people while elevating others. The question that would echo through courtrooms and community meetings for months afterward was simple and devastating. Who pays for that damage? And more importantly, who profits from it? She moved through the city the way she always had, focused, deliberate, carrying the quiet discipline of years spent answering to orders and saving others. Dr. Maya Reeves, though few people in her neighborhood knew to call her Doctor, and she'd never corrected them, had learned precision in two places: the Army Medical Corps and the emergency rooms of understaffed public hospitals. Off-duty now, in a plain jacket that had seen 3 winters and a sedan that had logged 140,000 miles of reliability, she drove from a small apartment in the Riverside neighborhood, a cluster of blocks that everyone else in the city called a problem area or high crime zone, with the casual certainty of people who'd never lived there. To Maya, it was home. It was the faces that greeted her at the corner store. Mrs. Chun, who always saved the freshest vegetables for her, knowing Maya worked long shifts and couldn't always shop during normal hours. It was the church bells on Sunday mornings at Bethel, Aim, where her grandmother's name was still engraved on a memorial plaque. It was Mr. Washington's barbecue joint that smelled like hickory and heritage, and the community garden where teenagers learned to grow tomatoes under the supervision of elders who remembered when this neighborhood had been redlined out of prosperity. She knew these streets the way a surgeon knows anatomy, every artery of asphalt, every nerve of side street, every pressure point where poverty and pride intersected. The neighborhood had history written in its architecture. Beautiful brick buildings from the 1920s that had housed black-owned businesses during segregation, now faded and fighting against neglect. The park where children played had new equipment finally after 3 years of fundraising, because the city budget somehow never reached this far south. The murals on the community center told stories of resistance and resilience. Harriet Tubman's determined face, Martin Luther King's raised hand, local heroes who died too young to violence that everybody talked about but nobody with power seemed interested in preventing. Maya had grown up 6 blocks from where she lived now, in a house her grandfather had bought in 1968 with money saved from 2 jobs and a dream, deferred but not destroyed. She'd left for college on a full ROTC scholarship, served 2 tours as a combat medic, come home with commendations and invisible wounds, then put herself through medical school with the determined focus of someone who knew that every achievement was both personal victory and communal vindication. She'd chosen emergency medicine because it was immediate, because it was honest, because a hemorrhage didn't care about your address and a stopped heart didn't discriminate. In the she was Dr. Reeves, respected and essential. On these streets, she was Maya, Coach Reeves's granddaughter, the girl who'd made good and come back anyway. That evening, the sun slid low behind the downtown skyline, painting the older buildings in amber light that softened their rough edges. Traffic thickened with the usual 6 p.m. surge workers heading home, parents picking up kids from after-school programs, delivery trucks making final rounds. Maya was tired in the specific way that comes from a 12-hour shift dealing with chest pains and broken bones and the quiet desperation of people who'd waited too long to seek care because they couldn't afford it. She changed out of her scrubs in the hospital locker room, pulled on jeans and the jacket, grabbed her bag, and headed to her car in the employee lot where security cameras watched over vehicles, but somehow never prevented the occasional break-in. The drive home was automatic, a route she could navigate half asleep. North on Hamilton, west on Riverside Boulevard, then the final turn onto Madison Street where her apartment waited with its small balcony and the spider plant she'd somehow kept alive for 3 years. She had groceries to buy, her fridge was down to condiments and regret, and she'd promised to call her mother, who worried with the intensity of someone who'd watched too many news reports about her daughter's neighborhood. Ahead, she saw the flashing lights first, red and blue strobing against the dimming sky. A line of police cruisers forming a checkpoint across both lanes of Riverside Boulevard. Not unusual. The city had been running these safety checkpoints for 6 months now. Always in the same neighborhoods, always with the same explanations about crime prevention and community safety. Maya had been through 3 of them before brief professional interactions where she'd shown her license and registration, answered a few questions, and been waved through with the bored efficiency of bureaucratic routine. This time felt different from the start. Asterisk, the first officer waved her forward with a flashlight, and she rolled to a stop behind a silver Honda that was being cleared through. The officer approached her window-white mid-30s, the kind of mustache that suggested he took his authority seriously. She had her license and registration ready before he asked, the practiced compliance of someone who'd learned that smoothness prevented escalation. License and registration, he said, not looking at her yet. She handed them over. He glanced at the license and something changed in his posture. Subtle, but she'd learned to read body language in combat zones where survival meant noticing when a situation shifted from stable to dangerous. 1247 Madison Street, he read aloud, not as information but as accusation, his voice carrying to the other officers nearby. Riverside. That's correct, Maya said, her voice even professional. The tone she used with difficult patients who needed to be calmed before they could be helped. He looked at her fully now, and she watched the assessment happen behind his eyes. Black woman, late 30s, old car, Riverside address. She could see him assembling a profile, filling in blanks with assumptions that had nothing to do with who she actually was. This your car? He asked. Yes, sir. Registration's in your hand. Step out of the vehicle, please. Maya's heartbeat picked up pace, but her training held. May I ask why? Routine inspection. Step out, please. Nothing about this was routine. The Honda ahead had driven away. The car behind her was being waved around to a different lane, a white couple in business attire who got a cursory glance and a wave through. But Maya was being singled out. And she knew with the certainty of experience that her address had triggered something in whatever protocol or prejudice governed this checkpoint. She stepped out carefully, hands visible, movements slow. 2 more. Officers had drifted over, and she clocked them with the automatic assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats. One older, heavyset, bored expression. One younger, early 20s, hand resting near his holster with an eagerness that made her stomach tighten. You coming from work? The first officer asked. Yes, sir. I'm a doctor at County General. The young officer smirked. Yeah, what kind? Of doctor? Emergency medicine. Huh. The smirk widened, disbelieving. That's so. The first officer was running her license, speaking into his radio in tones too low for her to hear clearly. She caught fragments. ... Riverside resident. Want to run a full... The older officer walked around her car, peering in windows, taking his time. This vehicle's been reported in connection with drug activity in the Riverside area, the first officer said, returning to her window. Maya felt ice in her chest. That's not possible. I've owned this car for 6 years, and I've never been involved in any criminal activity. We're going to need to search the vehicle. I don't consent to a search. The temperature dropped. All 3 officers focused on her now, and the young one's hand shifted closer to his weapon. You don't consent? The first officer's voice had gone flat, dangerous. Ma'am, we have reasonable suspicion. Based on what? My address? Maya kept her voice level, but her mind was racing, calculating. She knew her rights. She also knew that rights were sometimes just words on paper, especially at 6:15 p.m. on Riverside Boulevard, with 3 officers who'd already decided what narrative they were writing. You said my car was reported in connection with drug activity. What's the report number? When was it filed? What's the specific complaint? Asterisk, the older officer laughed, a sound like gravel sliding. We got a lawyer here, boys. I'm asking legitimate questions about the basis for a search. If you have probable cause, you should be able to articulate it. Probable cause is that you're being obstinate, the young officer said, and the first officer didn't correct him, which told Maya everything about how this was going to go. Asterisk, I'm asserting my Fourth Amendment rights. Maya said clearly, knowing that somewhere someone might be recording, might be watching. I do not consent to a search. If you choose to search anyway, I'm stating for the record that it's against my will and without my consent. The first officer's jaw tightened. He gestured to the others, and they moved like a choreographed unit, like they'd done this dance 100 times before. Hands on her shoulders, turning her, pressing her forward against the hood of her car. The metal was still warm from the engine, and she felt it through her jacket as they positioned her, spread her arms, kicked her feet apart. "This is unnecessary," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm cooperating." "You're obstructing," the first officer said, close to her ear. "That's not cooperation." Asterisk, they searched her anyway, of course. Hands in pockets, patting down. The kind of thorough search that was meant to intimidate as much as investigate. The young officer pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, her keys from her jeans. "Hey, Sarge," he called to the older officer. "Check this out." "Nice phone." "Expensive." He paused, grinned. "How's someone from Riverside afford a phone like this?" "I work full-time as a physician," Maya said, her voice tight now, anger bleeding through the professional calm. "I can afford a phone?" "Sure you can," the young officer said, pocketing it. "We're gonna hold on to this for now. Evidence." "Evidence of what?" "I haven't been charged with anything." "Yet," he said, and the malice in that single word was crystalline. They moved to the car, and she watched them tear through it with practiced carelessness. Glove compartment dumped, seats pushed forward. Her gym bag opened and emptied onto the asphalt. Her stethoscope tumbled out, the ID badge she'd forgotten to remove from her scrub pocket, a protein bar, and a worn copy of a medical journal. The young officer picked up the stethoscope, examined it like it was a curiosity from another. "Planet. This real?" he asked. Maya didn't answer. She was cataloging now the way she'd been trained. Officer 1, the first one who'd stopped her, wore badge number 2847. Officer 2, young, aggressive, was 3192. Officer 3, older, the sergeant, was 1456. She memorized the numbers with the same focus. She used for medication dosages and protocol steps. She noted the patrol car numbers, 847 and 851. She observed which officers had body cameras, all three. But Officer 2's was angled wrong, pointing at the ground more than at her. And Officer 3's had been switched off, the small red recording, light conspicuously absent. A small crowd had gathered at the edges of the checkpoint. Other drivers slowed and diverted, pedestrians stopping on the sidewalk. A young black woman, maybe 25, held up her phone, recording. An older Latino man stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. A white couple hurried past, avoiding eye contact, the woman clutching her purse closer. "We got an audience," the sergeant said, noticing. "Let's wrap this up." "Found something," Officer 2 said from inside her car, his voice triumphant. He emerged holding a small plastic bag, clear with white residue inside. Maya's blood turned to ice water. "That's not mine. Found it under your seat." He held it up like a trophy. "That's not mine," Maya repeated, louder now. "I've never seen that before. You planted that." "Careful," Officer 1 said. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." "That's not mine." Officer 2 was already walking to his patrol car, bag in hand, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the game and knew he was winning. The sergeant pulled out handcuffs, actual metal handcuffs, cold and heavy. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance." "This is a setup," Maya said, and heard her voice crack for the first time. "This is corruption. That's planted evidence, and you all know it." "Turn around," the sergeant said, not unkindly but not with sympathy either. Just procedure, just the machinery grinding forward. She turned. The cuffs closed around her wrists that had steadied soldiers bleeding out in desert heat, wrists that had compressed chests and delivered babies and sutured, wounds that would have killed their owners without immediate care. The metal bit into her skin, tight enough to hurt, tight enough to leave marks. She cataloged that too. Excessive force, unnecessary pain, the physical articulation of contempt. They loaded her into the back of patrol car 847. The seat hard plastic designed to be hosed down, the cage separating her from the front seats thick enough to make conversation impossible. Through the window, she watched Officer 2 seal the plastic bag in an evidence envelope with exaggerated care, making a show of proper procedure for any cameras that might be watching. She watched Officer 1 speak to the young woman who'd been recording, saw him gesture for her phone, saw the woman shake her head and step back. He didn't pursue it. Too many witnesses now, too much exposure. The drive to the station took 11 minutes. Maya counted, her internal chronometer as precise as the watch on her wrist. A watch that looked ordinary but wasn't. A watch that had cost her 3 months' salary and carried capabilities the officers hadn't considered. She pressed her thumb against the side button, a gesture that looked like anxious fidgeting, but activated a recording function that would capture every sound. Every word, time-stamped and stored in encrypted cloud storage that couldn't be deleted by anyone without her biometric access. The precinct building was old brick, the same vintage as the beautiful buildings in Riverside, but maintained better. The city's priorities written in which neighborhoods got fresh paint and which got neglect. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with the particular frequency that induced headaches, and the air smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. They processed her at the front desk. Name, address, occupation. The clerk, a Latina woman in her 50s, looked up sharply when Maya said, "Physician." "You're a doctor?" Her tone suggested she was reevaluating something. "Yes, emergency medicine at County General." The clerk's eyes flicked to the officers, then back to Maya, and something passed across her face, sympathy, maybe, or recognition of an injustice. But she said nothing, just typed information into a computer that was probably older than Officer 2. Asterisk, they took her to an interview room. Gray walls, metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, one-way mirror, camera in the corner with a red light that may or may not have been recording. Officer 1 and the sergeant came in. The sergeant carrying a folder that looked official and smelled faintly of leather and old paper. "Dr. Reeves," the sergeant began, and the use of her title felt mocking. "We're going to make this simple. You've been caught with a controlled substance. The lab will test it, but it looks like cocaine, and if it is, you're looking at possession. Maybe intent to distribute given the amount. That's serious time, especially for a professional. Medical license gone, career over. You understanding me?" Maya looked at him steadily. "I understand that you're describing a fabricated scenario based on planted evidence." Officer 1 leaned forward. "Here's the thing, Doc. You seem like a smart woman. You've got a career, a life. Why would you throw that away? We're offering you a chance here. You cooperate. Tell us what we need to know about the dealers in Riverside. Give us some names, and we can make this go away. Simple possession, first offense, maybe you do community service, keep your license, everybody wins. Except the innocent people you want me to lie about," Maya said. "Nobody's asking you to lie," the sergeant said. "We're asking you to help clean up your neighborhood. There's drug activity there, we all know it, you know it. You see those kids on corners, you see the houses we know are dealing, help us help you." Maya said nothing. She'd done interrogation resistance training in the military. Hours of practice in keeping silent when silence was the best weapon. She folded her hands on the table, awkward with cuffs, but possible, and looked at the one-way mirror, wondering who was behind it, who was watching this theater. "The strong, silent type," Officer 1 said. "That's fine, we've got time. We've got evidence. We've got witnesses who saw you acting suspicious at the checkpoint." "Witnesses, you mean the officers who planted the evidence?" Maya asked. The sergeant's face hardened. "That's slander, Dr. Reeves. Be careful. You're in enough trouble without adding false accusations against police officers to the list. It's not slander if it's true. It's testimony." They went back and forth for 20 minutes, and Maya said nothing of substance, answered no questions, provided no names. She watched the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping its slow circle, counting down to something the officers didn't know was coming. Asterisk, finally, they left her alone. The room was cold, deliberately so, another small cruelty, designed to increase discomfort and encourage compliance. Maya closed her eyes and breathed, centering herself the way she'd learned to do before difficult surgeries, before moments when steadiness meant survival. She thought about her grandfather, who'd been arrested in 1963 for sitting at a lunch counter, who'd spent 3 days in a cell that made this interview room look comfortable, who'd walked out with his head high and his resolve harder. She thought about her mother, who'd been pulled over 17 times in 10 years for driving while black, who'd taught Maya to keep her hands visible and her voice calm and to never, ever give them an excuse. She thought about the patients. She'd treated the young men with scars from stop-and-frisk encounters, the women who'd been harassed, the families who'd been torn apart by a system that criminalized poverty and pigmented skin with ruthless efficiency. The door opened. A new officer entered. Older, white, the kind of weather-beaten face that spoke of decades on the force. He wore lieutenant's bars and an expression of weary authority. Dr. Reeves, he said, sitting down across from her. I'm Lieutenant Morrison. I understand we've had some difficulties tonight. That's one word for it, Maya said. He opened the folder, scanned pages with a practiced eye. Says here you were stopped at a routine checkpoint, refused to comply with a lawful search, and were found in possession of cocaine. That's the official story. What's yours? Maya studied him. Was this good cop, bad cop, another manipulation? Or was this a crack in the facade, a moment of genuine question? She decided to bet on truth because lies required maintenance, and she was too tired for that game. I was racially profiled based on my address, she said clearly. I was subjected to a warrantless search after asserting my Fourth Amendment rights. Evidence was planted in my vehicle by Officer 3192. I was arrested on false charges. And that's my story, and it's documented by my watch, which has been recording audio since the moment I was stopped and by at least one civilian witness. Who was filming the encounter? Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Your watch is recording? Yes, and it's been streaming to secure cloud storage since 6:13 p.m. Timestamped, encrypted, admissible in court. Every word the officers said, every action they took. All of it. The lieutenant sat back. His expression was unreadable, but Maya saw calculation happening, pieces moving on a board she'd only partially revealed. That's interesting, he said finally. It's also legal, Maya said. I'm in a public space, there's no expectation of privacy, and I'm recording my own interaction with public officials, well, within my rights, and the witness with the phone. I don't know her name, but she was standing on the southeast corner of Riverside and Hamilton, wearing a red jacket, recording on a Samsung phone. The footage will corroborate everything I've said. Morrison closed the folder. I'm going to need to make some calls. Take your time, Maya said. I've got 43 minutes. 43 minutes until what? Until people who outrank you start asking questions you won't want to answer. Asterisk, she'd made one phone call, as was her right. Not to a lawyer, though she had a good one, a civil rights attorney she'd met through community organizing. Not to her mother, who would be worried sick, but couldn't help right now. She'd called a number that connected to an office in Washington, D.C., to people who worked in an oversight organization that existed specifically for moments like this. The National Law Enforcement Accountability Project, NLEAP. Maya was a member. Had been since her second year of medical practice when she'd treated one too. Many patients with police-inflicted injuries and no recourse for justice. She paid her dues, she attended the trainings, she knew the protocols. She'd activated an emergency response for unlawful detention. And the machinery of federal oversight was now grinding into motion, building momentum with every passing minute. NLEAP had connections to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, to elected officials who owed favors or feared publicity. More importantly, they had data years of it, patterns of complaints and settlement payments, and officers with histories of misconduct who kept getting protected by unions and qualified immunity. They had legal teams ready to file motions and draft complaints and mobilize media attention. They had researchers who could pull up every checkpoint location and cross-reference it with neighborhood demographics and prove systemic racism with the cold precision of mathematics. And they had a 43-minute response protocol for members in emergency situations. Verify the detention, identify the facility, notify appropriate oversight authorities, and prepare for escalation. Maya had triggered that protocol at 6:47 p.m. It was now 7:15. In 15 minutes, the phones would start ringing. Lieutenant Morrison came back into the interview room at 7:23, and his expression had changed. Behind him came a woman Maya didn't recognize. African-American, late 40s, wearing a gray suit that screamed federal authority. Dr. Reeves, the woman said, her voice cool and professional. "I'm Special Agent Denise Richardson, FBI. I understand. You've filed a complaint with the National Law Enforcement Accountability Project regarding your detention here tonight." "That's correct." "I'm going to need you to walk me through exactly what happened from the moment you were stopped." Maya did, laying out the timeline with the precision of a medical case presentation. What was said, what was done, what she observed, what she recorded. Richardson took notes, asked clarifying questions, requested badge numbers and patrol car identifications. Lieutenant Morrison sat silent, his face growing grayer as the story unfolded. "Your watch," Richardson said. "I'll need that as evidence." "It's biometrically locked to me," Maya said. "But I can transfer the files to a secure server you designate. The originals will remain in encrypted storage accessible only to me and my attorney. That's acceptable." Richardson looked at Morrison. "Lieutenant, I'm going to need the arrest report, the evidence log, and body camera footage from all officers involved in this stop." "Agent Richardson, with respect, this is an ongoing local investigation, which is now also a federal investigation into potential civil rights violations." Richardson interrupted. "The body camera footage, Lieutenant. Now." The room's power dynamic had shifted so completely it was almost visible, like watching a dam break and water flooding downhill. Morrison left, returned 10 minutes later with files and a tablet. Richardson reviewed the body camera footage with Maya watching over her shoulder. Officer 1's camera showed the stop, showed Maya's calm compliance, showed her clearly stating she did not consent to a search. Officer 2's camera angled toward the ground showed almost nothing useful. Officer 3's camera had been off, as Maya had noted, the absence of footage damning in its convenience. Asterisk. "Where's the footage of the search?" Richardson asked. "Should be there," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's not. We've got the initial stop, we've got her refusal to consent, and then we've got to jump to her in cuffs. The actual search where the alleged drugs were found isn't recorded by anyone. How convenient. There might have been a technical issue, Lieutenant." Richardson's voice could have cut steel. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence. We both know what happened here. The question is whether you were part of it or just cleaning up after it." Asterisk what happened over the next 2 hours was a controlled demolition of the officer's narrative. Richardson called in 2 more FBI agents and a civil rights attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They interviewed the desk clerk, who confirmed that Maya had identified herself as a physician, that the officers had laughed about it, that Officer 2 had made a comment about quotas being easier to meet in Riverside. They pulled radio transcripts that showed Officer 1 requesting a probable cause assist before he'd even finished running Maya's license. They subpoenaed checkpoint data and found that in 6 months of operation, 73% of vehicles searched had been driven by people of color, despite the checkpoint being on a road where traffic demographics were far more balanced. They found the witness her name was Jasmine Torres, the young woman with the red jacket and Samsung phone, and her footage was damning. It showed Officer 2 walking to his patrol car, opening the trunk, returning with something palmed in his hand, then bending into Maya's car briefly before finding the drugs. The footage wasn't perfect. He'd partially blocked the angle with his body. But combined with Maya's watch audio and the timeline evidence, it painted a clear picture of planted evidence and fabricated charges. Asterisk at 9:47 p.m. Officer 3192 Officer 2, whose name turned out to be Derek Mullins, was arrested by his own department. The charges: falsifying evidence, deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit civil rights violations. Officer 1, Christopher Hayes, was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Sergeant William Patterson was suspended without pay. Asterisk Maya was released at 10:15 p.m. The cuffs came off her wrists, leaving red marks that would fade in a day, but metaphorical scars that would last longer. Agent Richardson personally returned her phone, her keys, her ID, everything the officers had taken. Asterisk Dr. Reeves. Richardson said as they stood in the precinct lobby, the same space where Maya had been processed 3 hours earlier. "I want you to know that what you did tonight, the recording, the calm documentation, the preparation that probably saved your life, or at least your career, but it shouldn't have been necessary. You shouldn't have had to be that prepared for routine interaction with police. I know, Maya said, her voice hoarse from hours of controlled speech. But I'm black and I'm from Riverside, so I didn't really have a choice, did I? Asterisk Richardson's expression flickered with something that might have been shame or solidarity, or exhaustion with a system that kept breaking the same way. No, you didn't. And that's the problem we're going to fix. Maya drove home at 11:30 p.m. in a car that had been torn apart and hastily reassembled, past a checkpoint that had been dismantled, through streets that looked the same but felt different in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The grocery shopping didn't happen. The call to her mother would wait until morning. She parked in her building's lot, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and stood for a long moment in the doorway, looking at the familiar space, her couch, her books, her spider plant still alive, and felt the delayed shock hit like a wave. She'd been prepared. She'd done everything right. She'd known her rights, recorded the interaction, stayed calm, used the resources available to her. And still, she'd been arrested, cuffed, processed, charged with a felony she didn't commit. If she'd been someone else, someone without medical training, without military discipline, without the resources to join Emily Pay and afford a recording watch, what would have happened? How many people in Riverside had gone through similar experiences with no documentation, no witnesses, no federal agents to call, and were now carrying felony convictions that destroyed job prospects and education opportunities and the whole architecture of their futures? The thought was crushing. Not just what had happened to her, but what had happened to all the others, and what would keep happening despite tonight's small victory. She called her mother, who answered on the first ring. Maya? Baby, it's almost midnight. What's wrong? Maya told her and heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, the sound of a fear confirmed, a nightmare made real. But you're okay? You're home? They let you go? I'm okay. I'm home. The charges are dropped. Thank God. Thank God. Her mother's voice broke. I told you that neighborhood. Mama, it wasn't the neighborhood. It was the police. It could have happened anywhere I drive, anywhere I exist as a black woman in this city. The neighborhood's not the problem. The system is a long pause. Then, I know, baby. I know, I just die worry. I know. But I'm okay. And I'm going to make sure this matters, what happened tonight. It's not going to be just another story that disappears. She slept poorly, dreams fragmenting into moments of fluorescent light and cold metal, waking every hour to check her phone. To confirm the recording was still secure, to read the email from her NLEAP attorney outlining next steps. In the morning, her wrists bore faint marks from the cuffs and her mind bore the weight of a question. What now? Asterisk, the investigation that followed moved with the bureaucratic slowness of official channels and the urgent momentum of public attention. Agent Richardson's team pulled records dating back 3 years. Checkpoint data, arrest reports, complaint files. They found patterns that read like a prosecution brief. Riverside had the highest rate of vehicle searches despite having crime. Statistics comparable to or lower than 3 other neighborhoods. Officers Hayes, Mullins, and Patterson had been involved in 47 arrests from checkpoint stops, and 31 of those cases had either been dismissed or resulted in plea bargains with suspiciously reduced charges. Cocaine had been found. In 11 vehicles, always in small amounts, always under seats or in glove compartments, always resulting in arrests that went nowhere. The U.S. Attorney's Office convened a grand jury. Maya testified, her watch recording playing in a silent courtroom while jurors listened to Officer Mullins joking about quotas. Heard Sergeant Patterson discussing neighborhood cleanses. Watched body camera footage with convenient gaps where evidence should have been documented. Jasmine Torres testified, her phone video zooming in on the moment Mullins' hand moved from trunk to car to triumphant emergence with the plastic bag. The desk clerk testified, describing a culture where certain arrests were celebrated and certain neighborhoods were targeted. An analyst from NLEAP testified, displaying charts and graphs that showed racial disparities. So stark they couldn't be explained by chance, the indictments came down 6 weeks after Maya's arrest. Officer Mullins faced federal civil rights charges, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Officer Hayes was charged as an accessory and with deprivation of rights under color of law. Sergeant Patterson faced charges of conspiracy and failure to supervise, plus separate state charges for official misconduct. The checkpoint program was suspended pending a complete review. But criminal charges, while satisfying in their way, weren't the real victory. The real victory was the consent decree that followed, the federal oversight imposed on the police department, the requirements for data collection and bias training and community review boards. The real victory was the policy change that forbade checkpoints in residential neighborhoods without specific, documented cause, and that required all body cameras to be on during all public interactions with penalties for technical failures. The real victory was the $2.3 million settlement fund established for people who'd been wrongfully arrested at checkpoints, a number that represented not Maya's case alone, but the dozens of others that investigation had uncovered. And the real victory was the community meetings that followed, the voices that had been silenced finding volume, finding platform, finding each other. The first community meeting was held at Bethel Aim Church on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the indictments. Maya arrived early, expecting maybe 30 people, the usual activists, the concerned parents, the community organizers who showed up to everything. Instead, she found the sanctuary packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls, folding chairs set up in the aisles. 200 people, maybe more, from Riverside and the neighboring communities that had been similarly targeted. Pastor Williams opened with a prayer, his deep voice resonating off the vaulted ceiling. Lord, we gather tonight not in anger alone, though we have cause for anger. We gather seeking justice, seeking truth, seeking the courage to transform a system that has for too long weighed heavy on the backs of our people. Then Maya spoke. She hadn't planned a speech, hadn't written notes, but the words came with the clarity of testimony. 3 months ago, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit by officers who planted evidence, in a system designed to make that injustice routine. I was lucky I had resources, training, documentation, but I'm not here to talk about my luck. I'm here to talk about everyone who wasn't lucky, who didn't have cameras or recordings or federal contacts, who are living with convictions they didn't earn and consequences they don't deserve. She introduced others who came forward one by one, each with their own story. Marcus Williams, 28, arrested at a checkpoint 2 years ago for suspicious behavior that turned out to be him reaching for his registration when ordered, spent a night in jail, lost his job at the warehouse because he couldn't show up for his shift, ended up with a misdemeanor on his record that made finding new employment nearly impossible. He'd scraped by since then on part-time work and his grandmother's generosity. Kaisha Johnson, 34, pulled over at a checkpoint while driving her children home from soccer practice. Officers insisted they smelled marijuana, searched the car with her kids watching, terrified. Found nothing, but the memory of her 8-year-old son's face as officers went through his backpack haunted her. She'd started taking alternate routes that added 20 minutes to her commute, just to avoid that intersection. Robert Chun, 45, owner of a small grocery in Riverside, stopped at a checkpoint and questioned for 45 minutes about suspicious transactions at his store. They suggested he was facilitating drug deals by selling to the wrong kind of customers. He filed a complaint that went nowhere, watched his store's foot traffic drop as customers avoided the area, eventually had to cut his staff from 4 employees to 2. 17-year-old Tamika Reed, who'd been in the car with her older brother when he was arrested at a checkpoint for having a small amount of marijuana medication, actually prescribed for his chronic pain from a workplace injury. But the prescription bottle had been at home. He'd spent 3 days in jail before the prescription could be verified, lost his job, and the experience had left Tamika afraid of police, jumping at sirens, having panic attacks when she saw patrol cars, story after story, each one a small violence. A cut that bled trust and safety and the basic assumption that you could drive through your own city without being presumed criminal. The checkpoint program had operated for 18 months, conducted 2,847 stops, made 314 arrests, and destroyed countless lives in ways that never showed up in statistics. Agent Richardson attended that meeting, sitting in the back pew, listening. Afterward, she approached Maya. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, Richardson said quietly. Civil rights violations, police misconduct, systemic discrimination. Every case I build, I think maybe this is the one that changes things. But it just keeps happening. Different city, different faces, same pattern." "So why keep doing it?" Maya asked. Because every once in a while we win. And when we win, people like Mr. Williams get their records expunged. People like Ms. Johnson get to feel safe again. That's not nothing. It's not enough, Maya said. No. Richardson agreed. It's not. But it's what I can do from inside the system. What you're building here, she gestured at the crowd still gathered in small groups. Exchanging phone numbers, planning next steps, that's what changes the system itself. The checkpoint program, it turned out, was just one branch of a much older tree. As Maya and a growing coalition of community activists, lawyers, and sympathetic journalists dug deeper, they uncovered layers of institutional racism built into the city's policing and broader governance structure. The city's strategic policing plan, implemented 8 years earlier by a mayor who'd run on a tough-on-crime platform, had designated certain neighborhoods for enhanced enforcement. Enhanced. Enforcement meant more patrols, more stops, more surveillance. The designated neighborhoods were overwhelmingly Black and Latino, despite having crime rates comparable to, and in some cases, lower than predominantly white neighborhoods that received community partnership policing instead. A data analyst named Dr. James Lee from the university conducted an independent study using the city's own public data. His findings were damning. Black drivers were 4.7 times more likely to be stopped than white drivers, 8.3 times more likely to be searched, but 23% less likely to be found with contraband or evidence of criminal activity. The numbers suggested that aggressive policing wasn't about public safety, it was about control, about maintaining hierarchies, about reminding certain populations of their place in the social order. The checkpoints themselves had been funded through a federal grant program designed for DUI enforcement, but internal memos obtained through a Freedom of Information Act. Requests filed by Maya's attorney showed that the police department had deliberately shifted checkpoint locations from bar districts to residential neighborhoods explicitly, targeting high-crime areas that were code for communities of color. One memo, written by a deputy chief who'd since retired, was particularly revealing. Checkpoint operations in Riverside and similar zones serve dual purposes. They increase our arrests and citation numbers for grant reporting, and they establish police presence in communities that have historically shown resistance to law enforcement. Authority. Visible enforcement actions at strategic locations remind residents of consequences for known compliance. Remind residents of consequences. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Checkpoints weren't about catching criminals. They were about maintaining a climate of fear and demonstrating power. Maya read that memo 3 times, feeling her anger crystallize into something colder and more focused. This wasn't individual prejudice or bad apples. This was policy intentional and documented. Maya's life had changed in ways both public and private. Her story had been picked up by national news outlets. CNN ran a segment. The New York Times published an in-depth feature. NPR did an interview that was broadcast during drive time. She became, against her will and intention, a symbol of face. For the movement against racially biased policing, the attention brought consequences. Her social media filled with messages of support and solidarity, but also with vicious hatred, racist slurs, death threats, accusations that she'd fabricated everything for attention or money. Someone posted her home address online with the suggestion that people should pay her a visit. She had to change her phone number twice. At the hospital, some colleagues embraced her, praised her courage, attended rallies in her support. But others grew distant. The hospital administration asked her to avoid controversial public statements that might compromise the institution's neutrality. When she refused, she was reassigned from the emergency department to a less visible position in urgent care, officially described as a routine rotation, but transparently punitive. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the hospital's chief of staff, a white woman in her 60s who'd been cordial to Maya, for years called her into her office for a meeting that was technically friendly but functionally threatening. Dr. Reeves, we value your service here, and of course we support your rights as a citizen. But the hospital has to maintain relationships with law enforcement. Officers bring us patients, work with us on safety protocols, coordinate on mass casualty events. Your very public ... is creating tensions. You mean my very public refusal to accept being framed for a felony is inconvenient, Maya said flatly. Morrison's smile was thin. I mean that your visibility is affecting the hospital's ability to function neutrally in the community. There's no neutral position when it comes to civil rights violations. There's justice or there's complicity. That's a very black and white view of a complex situation. Maya almost laughed at the unintentional irony. Yes, it is black and white. Quite literally. She left that meeting knowing her time at County General was limited. She could fight the reassignment, file a complaint, make it another legal battle, or she could find a different path forward. The choice was exhausting to contemplate. At home, the stress manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. She slept poorly, jolting awake from dreams where she was back in that interview room, back in those cuffs, but this time there was no recording, no federal agents, no way out. She lost weight, forgot to eat meals, subsisted on coffee and the protein bars she kept in her bag. Her mother called daily, worried, pushing her to rest, to step back, to let someone else carry the burden for a while. You can't save everyone, baby, her mother said. You're going to burn yourself out. I'm not trying to save everyone, Mama. I'm trying to save the next person from what happened to me. And who's going to save you? Maya didn't have an answer for that. Officer Derek Mullins' trial began on a cold morning in February, 7 months after Maya's arrest. A federal courthouse was imposing, all marble and flags and the weight of institutional authority. Maya sat in the gallery with Jasmine Torres, Marcus Williams, and 24 other community members who'd taken time off work to witness justice. The prosecution was methodical, building their case piece by piece. The watch recording played in court, Maya's calm voice asserting her rights and Mullins' casual contempt audible to everyone. Jasmine's video, enhanced by FBI forensic analysts, showing Mullins' movements frame by frame. The testimony of other checkpoint arrestees whose cases had been dropped once investigation revealed similar patterns of planted evidence. A forensic accountant showing how arrest numbers directly correlated to grant funding and department budget allocations. Mullins' defense was predictable. He was a dedicated officer following department protocol. The drugs were really there. Dr. Reeves was a sophisticated criminal who'd fabricated evidence to cover her guilt. His attorney, expensive defense lawyer paid for by the police union, tried to paint Maya as the real villain, manipulative, calculating, playing the race card for sympathy and eventual financial gain. Dr. Reeves, the defense attorney said during cross-examination, his tone oily with false sympathy, isn't it true that you've received substantial media attention for your allegations? That you've become something of a celebrity in certain activist circles? I've received media attention, Maya said evenly, because I was the victim of a civil rights violation. Or because you've crafted a compelling narrative that advances a particular political agenda. The only narrative I've crafted is the truth, documented and witnessed by multiple sources. The truth as you see it. But isn't it possible that you're mistaken? That you misinterpreted a routine police action as something more sinister because of your own preconceptions about law enforcement? Maya looked directly at the jury. I watched Officer Mullins take something from his trunk, approach my car, and then discover drugs that weren't there minutes before. That's not a misinterpretation. That's documented evidence tampering, and it's exactly as sinister as it appears. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Mullins' sentencing hearing 2 months later brought some measure of closure. The judge, an older black man who'd served on the bench for 20 years, delivered a statement that Maya would remember for the rest of her life. Officer Mullins, you were given a badge and the public trust that comes with it. You were empowered to protect and serve, to uphold the law and defend the constitutional rights of all citizens. Instead, you weaponized your authority to target vulnerable communities, to fabricate evidence, and to perpetuate a system of oppression that has no place in a democratic society. The harm you've caused extends far beyond Dr. Reeves. You've damaged public trust. You've traumatized community members, and you've reinforced the very divisions that make our city less safe for everyone. This court sentences you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. I only wish I could sentence you to feel the fear and helplessness that your victims felt. 4 years. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. It was accountability given form. Officer Hayes took a plea deal, 2 years probation. termination from the police force, cooperation with ongoing investigations. Sergeant Patterson fought the charges and lost, sentenced to 18 months for conspiracy and official misconduct. The consent decree that followed the criminal trials was a document of stunning specificity, 127 pages of requirements, restrictions, and reforms that would govern the police department for a minimum of 5 years. Maya served on the civilian oversight committee that helped draft it, sitting in conference rooms with federal monitors, civil rights attorneys, and community representatives, arguing over language that would determine how policing worked in practice. Some of the reforms were technical. Mandatory data collection on every stop, with demographic information and justification for searches. Quarterly reports analyzing patterns and disparities. Body camera requirements with penalties for technical failures that included suspension without pay. A civilian complaint board with actual investigative power and the authority to recommend termination. Some were cultural. Implicit bias training conducted by independent organizations, not police trainers. Community policing initiatives that required officers to spend time in neighborhoods without enforcement actions, building relationships instead of generating arrests. Promotion criteria that valued de-escalation skills and community trust rather than just arrest numbers, and some were structural. Elimination of arrest quotas and ticket targets. Requirement that checkpoint locations be approved by civilian oversight and rotated through all neighborhoods, not just communities of color. Independent prosecutors for police misconduct cases to eliminate conflicts of interest. Automatic review of all cases where officers had multiple sustained complaints. The police union fought every reform, naturally. They filed lawsuits claiming the consent decree violated officers' due process rights, that the reforms would make policing impossible, that crime would surge if officers were hamstringed by civilian oversight. The local police union president gave interviews claiming that the department was being punished for one bad apple and that the reforms were anti-police bias. Maya responded in an op-ed that went viral. If one bad apple was the problem, why? Did the system protect him? Why did his supervisors ignore complaints? Why did body cameras conveniently fail? Why did an entire checkpoint program target specific communities with mathematical precision? The bad apple defense fails when the barrel itself is rotten, when institutional practices create conditions where constitutional violations become routine. The pushback was intense but ultimately futile. Federal oversight couldn't be wished away by local resistance, and the consent decree moved forward with the backing of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the support of elected officials who'd read the polling data and knew which way the political winds were blowing. Implementation was messy, uneven, and frustrating. Some officers embraced the reforms. Others engaged in work slowdowns and passive resistance. There were setbacks and violations, incidents where old patterns reasserted themselves and required intervention. But slowly, tangibly, things began to change. The data told the story. In the first year of the consent decree, traffic stops in Riverside dropped by 42%, while stops in predominantly white neighborhoods increased by 23%, a normalization that suggested the previous disparity had been exactly what the evidence showed: targeted enforcement. Searches of black drivers dropped from 8.3 times the white driver rate to 2.1 times, disproportionate but moving in the right direction. Most significantly, complaints of officer misconduct dropped by 67%, suggesting that accountability measures were deterring bad behavior. Maya's case became a reference point for similar challenges across the country. Lawyers in other cities filed lawsuits citing the precedent. Community organizers used her story as a template for organizing resistance. The recording watch she'd worn became something of a symbol. Sales spiked, and the company started marketing it explicitly for civil rights documentation. She received invitations to speak at conferences, universities, congressional hearings. She testified before a House subcommittee about racially biased policing, sitting at a table with legal experts and academic researchers, telling her story to a room full of representatives who had the power to change federal law. Some of them listened. Representative Maria Santos, a Latina congresswoman from California, introduced the Reeves law, officially the Law Enforcement Accountability and Transparency Act, which would require all police departments receiving federal funding to collect and publicly report demographic data on stops, searches, and use of force. The bill had bipartisan support from moderates who saw it as reasonable oversight, and fierce opposition from conservatives who framed it as federal overreach. It passed the House. It stalled in the Senate. Welcome to democracy, Maya thought wryly. But the impact wasn't just legislative. It was cultural, educational, personal. High schools and colleges added her case to curriculum about civil rights and constitutional law. The watch recording became a teaching tool, played in classrooms and training sessions as an example of both rights and resistance. Young people, especially young people of color, saw her story and learned that they didn't have to accept injustice passively. That documentation was power, that the system could be challenged. Maya received letters, hundreds of them, from people she'd never met. A teenager in Atlanta who'd recorded a stop and frisk and used the video to get the charges dropped. A grandmother in Chicago who'd organized her church to monitor police checkpoints and document patterns. A law student in New York who'd been inspired to specialize in civil rights law. A mother in Philadelphia who'd taught her son about his rights and given him a recording device before he got his driver's license. Terrified but determined to prepare him. Each letter was a small reminder that pain could be transformed into purpose, that her worst day had become a catalyst for other people's courage. 2 years after her arrest, Maya stood in the same church where the first community meeting had been held, looking at a room full of people who'd become something more than a crowd. They'd become a movement. The Riverside Community Coalition had grown from a crisis response to an ongoing organization, advocating for policy reform, monitoring police compliance with the consent decree, providing support for people navigating the criminal justice system, organizing voter registration and turnout. They'd won some victories. 3 city council members who'd been resistant to reform were voted out, replaced by candidates who supported police accountability. The checkpoint program remained suspended. A civilian review board was now fully operational, with actual power to investigate and recommend discipline. The police budget had been reduced by 8%, with funds redirected to mental health services and youth programs, but the work was far from finished. Racism didn't evaporate because a few policies changed. Implicit bias didn't disappear because training was mandatory. The same week Maya stood in that church, a young man named Deshaun Harris had been shot by police 3 neighborhoods over. During a traffic stop, initial reports claimed he'd reached for a weapon, but witnesses said his hands were visible and empty. The investigation was ongoing, body camera footage was unavailable, and the familiar pattern threatened to repeat itself. "We can't let up," Maya told the assembled group, her voice carrying the weight of experience and exhaustion and determination. Reform isn't a destination we reach and then stop moving. It's a continuous practice, a muscle we have to keep exercising. Every time we think we've won, the system finds new ways to resist, and we have to be ready to push back again. She introduced Deshaun's mother, Mrs. Harris, who spoke through tears about a son who'd been studying engineering, who'd never been in trouble, who'd been driving home from his campus job when he was stopped for a broken taillight, who was now in the hospital with a gunshot wound to his abdomen, facing months of recovery and a lifetime of trauma. While the officer who shot him remained on duty pending investigation, the room responded with familiar anger and grief, but also with practiced organization. People broke into committees, legal support, media strategy, community monitoring, fundraising for Mrs. Harris's medical expenses. This was the work now, not just responding to crises, but building infrastructure to prevent them, to document them when they occurred, to demand accountability at every level. Maya had cut back her clinical hours at the hospital, had eventually left County General entirely after it became clear they wanted her quiet more than they wanted her employed. She now worked part-time at a community health clinic in Riverside and spent the rest of her time on what she'd come to think of as her other medical practice, diagnosing and treating the pathologies of systemic racism. It paid less. It provided no institutional prestige. It was exhausting in ways that 12-hour EE shifts had never been, because trauma patients eventually healed or didn't, but the trauma of racism was ongoing. Repetitive, a wound that kept reopening just when you thought scar tissue had formed, but it mattered. She knew it mattered because she saw the changes, small, incremental, incomplete, but real. She saw teenagers walking through checkpoints who knew their rights and had phones ready to record. She saw community members attending city council meetings, speaking up, demanding answers. She saw police officers who'd internalized new norms, who treated stops as interactions rather than confrontations, who'd learned that accountability was possible and professional. She saw Marcus Williams with a new job, his record expunged, his life no longer defined by a checkpoint arrest. She saw Keisha Johnson taking her kids through that intersection again without panic attacks. The checkpoint gone and the memory slowly losing its sharp edges. She saw Jasmine Torres in law school, studying civil rights law, determined to do this work professionally. And she saw herself not as a victim anymore, but as a survivor, an organizer, a voice in a choir that was growing louder. 3 years. After her arrest, Maya was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. The venue was impressive. A hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C., with hundreds of attendees, activists, lawyers, academics, some sympathetic politicians. She'd given dozens of talks by now, had refined her story into something practiced and powerful, knew which details landed and which phrases resonated, but standing at the podium, looking at a room full of people who already agreed with her, who were already committed to this work, she felt the limitation of preaching to the converted. The people who most needed to hear these truths were absent. The officers who still saw certain neighborhoods as occupied territory, the officials who prioritized order over justice, the voters who supported tough-on-crime policies without questioning, who got to define crime and who bore the cost of being tough. So instead of delivering her usual speech, Maya did something different. She told her story, yes, the checkpoint, the planted evidence, the arrest, the accountability that followed. But then she pivoted. I'm often asked what we do about police. Racism, she said. And that's the right question, but it's not the only question. Because police racism doesn't exist in isolation, it's connected to housing discrimination that creates segregated neighborhoods. It's connected to school funding formulas that leave some communities under-resourced. It's connected to employment discrimination that limits economic opportunity. It's connected to healthcare disparities that mean Black mothers die in childbirth at 3 times the rate of white mothers, even when controlling for income and education. She paused, letting the connections sink in. The officer who arrested me didn't invent racism. He inherited it, was trained in it, worked in a system structured by it. Holding him accountable was necessary and right. But if we stop there, if we treat police reform as the whole solution rather than one piece of a larger transformation, we'll keep having the same conversation 50 years from now. So the question I want to leave you with isn't just, how do we reform policing? It's, what kind of society do we want to build? One where some children are presumed innocent and others are presumed dangerous based on their zip code? One where constitutional rights are reliably protected for some people and casually violated for others? One where the promise of equal protection under law is just a promise never quite fulfilled? Or do we want something better? Something harder to build, but worth building? A society where everyone, regardless of race, regardless of neighborhood, regardless of how much money they have or who their parents were, can drive home from work without fear, can interact with police without terror, can raise children who don't have to learn survival strategies for existing in their own bodies? The room was silent, attentive. My arrest changed my life, but I don't want my story to be exceptional. I don't want to be the rare case where the system worked, where justice prevailed, where accountability caught up with abuse. I want my story to be mundane, just another example of what happens every time someone's rights are violated. They document it, they report it, and the system responds appropriately. Every single time. We're not there yet, we're not even close. But we're closer than we were 3 years ago. And if we keep pushing, we'll be closer still 3 years from now. That's the work. That's what I'm asking you to commit to. Not just punishment for individual officers who violate rights, but transformation of the systems that make those violations routine. The applause was sustained, genuine. But Maya knew applause wasn't. Action, and action was what mattered. 5 years after her arrest at a routine checkpoint, Maya Reeves sat in her living room on a Sunday morning, reading the newspaper. The consent decree governing the police department had been extended for another 3 years. Compliance was improving but not yet complete. Officer Derek Mullins was still in federal prison, eligible for parole in 8 months. The checkpoint program had never been reinstated. A new police chief, the city's first black woman in that role, had been appointed and was implementing reforms. That went beyond the consent decree's requirements. Riverside looked different now. In small ways, new street lighting paid for by redirected police budget funds, a community center offering after-school programs, more black-owned businesses opening. On the main commercial strip, crime rates had dropped slightly, not because of aggressive enforcement, but because of investment in root causes, in opportunity and support and community infrastructure. But the work continued. Just that week, another case had emerged, a young Latino woman stopped for suspicious behavior that turned out to be walking through a park in a white neighborhood. No arrest, but a traumatic encounter that she documented and reported. The Civilian Review Board was investigating. The pattern was quieter now, less blatant, but still present. Racism adapted, found new expressions, required constant vigilance. Maya's phone rang. It was Jasmine Torres, calling from her first-year associate position at a civil rights law firm. Dr. Reeves, we've got a potential case I'd like to run by you. Young man stopped in Riverside, says the officers were aggressive, made comments about his address. He recorded part of it on his phone. Does it sound familiar? Maya smiled despite the exhaustion the question brought. It sounds like Tuesday. Send me the details. I'll review the recording and connect him with the Community Legal Fund. This was the work now, not just her own justice, but a system for justice. Infrastructure that could respond to each new case. Protocols that turned individual resistance into collective power. It wasn't the dramatic victory she might have fantasized about in that jail cell 5 years ago. It was better because it was sustainable, reproducible, a model that could spread. She hung up and returned to the newspaper, to an op-ed written by a young activist citing her case as inspiration for a campaign against discriminatory policing in another city, another state. The ripples continued spreading. Later that afternoon, Maya drove to the corner where she'd been stopped, where the checkpoint used to operate. The intersection looked ordinary now. Traffic flowing, people going about their lives, no flashing lights or intimidation. But she would always remember, the fear and anger and humiliation of that evening. The cold metal of handcuffs, the certainty that the system was designed to break her. She also remembered what came after. The resistance, the accountability, the transformation that was incomplete but real. She thought about the question she'd posed in her testimony, the one that had echoed through courtrooms and community meetings. If dignity can be stripped so easily from one neighborhood, who among us is ever truly safe? The answer, she'd learned, was that safety came not from avoiding injustice, but from building systems that responded to it, from communities that refused to accept it, from individuals who documented and resisted and demanded better. Safety came from the work. A young black man walked past her parked car, headphones in, moving with the easy confidence of someone who wasn't afraid. He didn't know her story, didn't know that his ability to walk those streets without constant fear was built in part on what she and countless others had fought for. That was good. That was the goal, not to be remembered, but to be unnecessary. For her story to fade into the background as injustice became rare enough to be genuinely shocking rather than depressingly routine. She started her car and drove home through streets that were the same and different, in a city that was changing slowly, imperfectly, but changing. The question that had haunted her that night in the jail cell, who pays for that damage, had been answered at least partially. The officers had paid with prosecution and termination. The department had paid with oversight and reform. The city had paid with settlements and policy changes. But the fuller answer was more complex. Everyone paid because racism damaged everyone, especially those who thought themselves exempt from its consequences. And everyone would benefit from its dismantling. From a society that actually delivered on the promises of equal protection and justice for all. The work would continue tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. There would be setbacks and victories, exhaustion and renewal, moments of despair and moments of transcendent hope. But the work would continue because it had to, because the alternative acceptance of injustice as inevitable was unthinkable. Maya Reeves parked in her lot, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and stood on her small balcony looking at the neighborhood she'd never stopped calling home. The sun was setting, painting the brick buildings in amber light. and somewhere a church bell was ringing. Tomorrow she had clinic hours, a community coalition meeting, and a call with a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell stories of police accountability. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Today, for just a moment, she allowed herself to feel what she'd earned, not quite peace, not quite closure, but something like hope. And that, she thought, was enough to build on.